Part 1.
You will hear some students talking about their studies.
First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 4.
Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 4.
It was packed. There simply aren't enough seats in Theatre 4. There were people on the stairs, people in the aisles. I don't imagine everybody was able to get in.
Was Jack with you?
No, of course not. I saw him with a pile of journals in the library as I walked past. You haven't seen him because you've been in here in the kitchen drinking coffee all morning, whereas he has been studying hard.
Not me. I've been in my bedroom reading for my assignment on education in the classical world. Very interesting. It was easier than I expected. I should have been at the gym training for my next race, but that'll have to wait. And did you find your first lecture interesting?
Absolutely fascinating. We talked about this experiment. If you show a child a litre of water in a bucket and show him a litre of water in a tall container, he always thinks that the higher, taller but narrower container has more water in it.
Hold on, what do you show him?
Right. You show him two things. A bucket with a litre of water in it, and also a tall glass vase-like thing or any tall container. This also has a litre of water in it. Now, he will say that the tall thing has more in it than the short fat thing, that is, the bucket. And all children will say this, that is, up to about 5 years of age. You can then actually pour a litre of water from the bucket into the taller, narrower container, and the child will still say that the tall container contains more water, even though he's just seen the water come out of the bucket.
And what's the point of that? Is it about measurement?
No, it showed how children are quite unable to think logically. It's connected with my assignment. It's about cognitive development of young children over time. That's to say, it's about how they think. But didn't you do that assignment last year?
No, I didn't. You see, I missed out on the first year when I changed subject.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 5 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 5 to 10.
Now answer questions 5 to 10.
I started psychology in the second year, which is where I am now.
Lucky you.
I'm not so sure. I've missed out on a lot of the basic stuff like that, and I will have to catch up in my own time, so I'm relying on you.
Oh yes, I remember. What did you study before you changed?
I studied law.
Why didn't you continue?
I found some of the subjects interesting enough. In fact, the criminal area was fascinating in general. But a lot of the law is very technical. It's full of little details which can be very difficult to understand. And I've got a terrible memory too. I could never get all the rules and exceptions into my head. My number one hate really was international trade, which was a minefield of rules and exceptions. In fact, I think it was a complete nightmare.
But law is such a popular subject. Lots of people would like to study it.
I'm sure they would, but they often don't realise that it's very book-based. You spend most of your time reading about famous cases sitting in a stuffy library, and very occasionally you get out to a lecture or maybe a seminar.
What do you find that's better about psychology?
Most of all, I like the experimental psychology we have to study. This involves doing something, so it's practical, and with any luck you can make a small, very small, contribution to knowledge. And it is so useful in many careers, for example, business, commerce, education.
Law is too, you know.
Yes, but the training is so long. You have to spend at least another 2 years on a professional practice course before you can start working. No, I'm happy with psychology.
Well, as a psychology student too, I must say I agree with absolutely everything you've said, of course.
That is the end of part 1.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to Part 2.
Part 2.
You will hear a lecture on bird migration.
First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 17. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 17.
My lecture this evening will focus on the migration of birds. That is, how birds fly in big groups from different parts of the world at certain times of the year. In the first part of the lecture, I'll talk about the reasons why birds migrate, when they migrate, and which parts of the world they migrate from and to. To start with, why do birds migrate? Well, there are two main reasons. One, they migrate to look for food, and two, they travel to parts of the world that are more suitable for breeding. In fact, these reasons are closely linked. As you can imagine, when birds are breeding, they need extra food to feed their young. And in the spring, in the cooler climates of Europe, there is a lot of food for birds, especially insects. So, generally, during the spring, birds fly up from the tropics, which are hot, to cooler climates in the north. They stay there for a few months to bring up their young. And then, when the weather in the north gets cold in the winter, they fly back to warmer climates in the south. Now I'd like to talk a bit about how global warming has affected bird migration. One of the effects of global warming has been to make the spring come earlier in the northern regions of the world. When spring comes early, the plants and insects that birds need to bring up their young are also available earlier. Research has shown that quite a lot of birds have started to migrate earlier because of higher temperatures. But unfortunately for some species, this hasn't been early enough. What I'm saying is that birds that are travelling a long way for breeding may arrive too late to find enough food to feed their young, and their population drops drastically. Scientists are currently researching more about this.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 18 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 18 to 20.
Now, I thought I'd finish by just briefly describing a few different patterns of migration. Migration varies with the type of bird and the area they come from. For example, one kind of migration is partial migration. This means that some birds in a particular species will migrate and others won't. It usually depends on how the weather affects food supplies, and very often happens in the tropics. In another migratory pattern, a bird called an Arctic tern migrates the whole length of the globe, from the North Pole to the south. The Arctic tern travels between 12 and 15,000 kilometres each way when it migrates in a complete circle around the world. It's quite amazing. Right, and lastly, I'd like to mention a pattern which isn't nearly as spectacular, but is very interesting. And this is the way many birds migrate across North America. In this pattern, the birds fly northwards in the west of the country and then back south again in the east. So, if you imagine it, they're actually migrating in a circular pattern, like the hands of a clock, not in a straight line, as we might think.
That is the end of Part 2.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to Part 3.
Part 3.
You will hear a woman talking about a number of different beaches to a group of tourists.
First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
Right, let's move on to the beaches here, which are absolutely beautiful. You do have over 100 to choose from. They're mostly sandy beaches and they vary from the largest, which is 2.5 kilometres long, to tiny sandy coves. But there are a few that I'd really recommend you to visit. So, looking at this pamphlet, first of all, there's Bandela Beach. This beach is 1 kilometre away from the old fishing village of Bandela, which is a beautiful spot. If you park in the car park behind it, there's a small path which leads down to the bay. It's very pretty because the whole beach is backed by pine trees, so it's very sheltered. The beach itself is very clean and the water is shallow and safe. That, together with the soft sand, make it an ideal beach for children and non-swimmers. A little further round the coast, again to the east, in the eastern corner of the island, is the spectacular Da Polata Beach, which is basically a long inlet. The land around this beach is marshland. It's all marsh, and there's a stream which winds through it, and the stream goes into the sea. And the beach has lovely pale gold sand. Access to this beach is quite tricky, and not for the less energetic. You have to go down a long flight of steps, 190 to be exact. But you'll be relieved to know that there's also a road which winds down to a car parking area. When you're level with the sea, there is a handful of shops and bars, and you can hire some beds and umbrellas. Continuing round the island, just past the tip of Calne, is the next beach I'd suggest you visit, and this is Sanget. Why? Because there isn't a beach longer than this on the island. If you want to know, it's exactly 2.5 kilometres long, and that's a bonus because it means it never gets overcrowded. It has golden sand and clear blue water shelving into the sea.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
It has golden sand and clear blue water shelving into the sea. There are several beach restaurants to choose from, and water sports are available when the water is calm. But check first. This beach operates a flag system, as the sea can get rough and you should always swim between the flags. There's a large car park which gives you easy access to the eastern end of the beach, but the western end is much quieter and more wild, as it is harder to reach. Blanaka is another popular beach, just in the northwest corner of the island. It has incredibly white sand and sparkling water. There is ample car parking here and plenty of bars and restaurants. Blanaka has white cliffs all around it, and for those of you who'd like a little more to do than just lazing on the beach, there are caves here which you can explore in the cliffs, and you can also dive into the water from rock platforms along the side of the cove. Well, my final recommendation for today is Disador. Now, this beach isn't quite as easy to get to as the others I've talked about. It's quite a remote little beach, tucked away here next to Blanaka.
You can reach Dissador by a steep slope which goes over some sandbanks. The beach itself is small and pretty, with reddish-coloured sand and some stony areas on its eastern side. Despite being quite small, the bathing is good, and you can also go fishing here from the rocks at either side. It's a good idea to take some food and drink with you if you decide to go here, as there's only one little bar which isn't always open. So, that should give you plenty of ideas to choose from over the next 2 weeks. And if you have any further questions...
That is the end of part 3.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turns to part 4.
Part 4. Listen to the introduction about Tower Bridge and complete the summary.
First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now, listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Tower Bridge is located in one of the most interesting parts of London. On either top of the tower, you can get a bird's-eye view of the wonderful scenery all round Tower Bridge. On its south side are many tall old buildings. On its north side stands the Tower of London itself. But Tower Bridge, the first bridge over the Thames, as you travel to London from the sea, is the most famous of them all. Although they look the same age, the tower is almost 1,000 years old, and Tower Bridge, which was built in the 1890s, is just over 100. Because of the tall ships up and down the Thames, it was proposed in 1850 that a bridge across the Thames near the tower was most necessary. However, the designers argued about the new bridge for about 30 years. They took so long because they had two big problems. One is that the new bridge must look like the old tower, and the other is that the bridge must not look like a modern bridge. They made it look like the old tower, so everyone was happy. Besides, the most surprising thing about Tower Bridge is that it opens in the middle while big ships are going through to the Pool of London. If you're lucky enough to see the bridge with its two opening arms high in the air, you'll never forget it. The bridge took 8 years to build and cost £900,000, a lot of money in those days. But it was a wonderful success and became a famous tourist attraction in London on the day when the bridge was completed. 100 years ago, the Thames was once London's busiest traffic route, so that the bridge opened at least 12 times a day. Today, big ships don't go so far up the Thames. Tower Bridge opens perhaps only twice a week, but the same wonderful machinery is still in good condition. Green, yellow and red, the colourful wheels and engines look smart and new, not 100 years old. They still lift the two heavy opening arms, each 1,000 tons, leaving 70 metres for the ships to go through. And they still can open and close the bridge in 1.5 minutes. Things are changing greatly now at Tower Bridge. The horses that used to help with pulling have gone, and so have the tugs, for they're no longer necessary. The walkways from one tower to the other at the top of the bridge were closed years ago because so many people jumped off them into the Thames, which is said to open again soon. In addition, the beautiful wheels will be part of a special exhibition for the public to visit. There'll be a restaurant in one of the towers and a pub in the other. But whatever happens in its exciting future, Tower Bridge will always mean London.
That is the end of part 4.
You now have half a minute to check your answers.